honor of having the Reverend Dr. Bobbi Patterson amidst us, among us, and I'm very excited about this. So, Bobbi, please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Nicole. Gosh, it's so great to see everybody, and I've been able to come to a couple of these Sunday school classes, and wow, what a series of classes. The group that's been working with Nicole on our engagement partnerships with communities, it's just been a terrific Sunday school series. I'm very impressed with it. It's been so rich, and I'm happy to be a small part of it. Nicole is going to kindly work with a PowerPoint I'm going to share today. And I think these are all aspects of thinking about place and place-based and faith-based partnerships that you all are aware of. But so I'm just reminding us of the power of place, and that learning is always part of being in a place. And when we think about our own community partnerships and engagement, we're going to be developing a kind of ordinary and spiritual relational solidarity with the communities we're a part of. And I remember a couple of weeks ago, Amy was talking about the idea, as we think about community partnership, of pausing to listen to our own lives and where God is calling us in this kind of partnership. What Thurman calls where the genuine in you, that's the seed God has already placed there. Where is that going to connect with the work of the church and of your own spiritual path? And places similarly are about listening to where God is working and the genuine depth of God's presence in a place, whether it's the trees you all were planting yesterday or the plants, people of all kinds. Also the kind of layers of human experience that we all are participating in, but that have happened over time in place. So we're going to be learning in our community engagement about what it means to be partners in a place. That's what I'm going to focus on today. And that's a really important aspect of our thinking about our service or community partnerships, because when we start working with other groups, we're going to be moving into the places of their lives, and in many cases over generations. And we can't really just come in there as if we're bringing our sense of what it means to be part of Epiphany without attending to the histories of their place, the history of humans that have lived in those neighborhoods, but also of the biological history, of the geological history, the cultural history. Those are all ways that that community has shaped itself, and we're learning to be in their place with them as a partner. It's very, very important to think about that. I was so impressed a couple of Sundays ago when Aaron and others had us take that history of Decatur experience together and began to see the place of Decatur in a much richer way. And last night, Friday night and over the weekend, the Poet Laureate of the United States, Joy Harjo, was with us at Emory, and maybe you heard her read her poetry. She is Muskogee Creek, and the actual land of Emory and the land of Epiphany, all of the land in this area belonged to the Muskogee Creek tribe. So to be in place here is to acknowledge that this land has been home to many creatures and humans, and some of them identified as Muskogee Creek. And acknowledging that is a way we build proximity. Brian Stevenson's word, we get to know people and do reconciling work more deeply. And that's what this little Sunday school time is about thinking about place and our community partnerships. So the second slide, I'm going to try to tie in with Howard Thurman's teachings that Luther introduced us to. This is one of the ways Howard Thurman talks about being in a place and the kind of incarnate experience of God in every place that we're opening up ourselves to when we make partnership with others. As a child, I was accustomed to spend many hours alone in my rowboat, fishing along the river when there was no sound save the tapping of the waves against the boat. There were times when it seemed as if the earth and the river and the sky and I were one beat of the same pulse. It was a time of watching and waiting for what I did not know, yet I always knew. There would come a moment when beyond the single pulse beat, there was a sense of presence, which seemed always to speak to me. My response to that sense of presence always had the quality of personal communion. There was no voice. There was no image. There was no vision. There was God. The idea of, as we move into community partnerships, recognizing that God has always been present fully in the fullness of these places, in their plants and in their land and in the histories and cultures. And that part of our call is to attend to that with a kind of quiet receptivity, a kind of pausing, to let that complexity arise for us. And it will take time, over time, as places reveal themselves over time. He was in this rowboat and in this place over many years. And that sense of learning to still ourselves in, you might say, the body of God in a place, to become open to that communication, is a practice. And Nicole and I were talking, and she was asking me about any experience I had had about songs of a place. In some ways, Thurman here is pointing to the earth and the sky and the river. They're singing a song of God's and learning to hear that song of place. And it brought back a memory to me when I was in a very unusual situation where song can be so important to the identity of places. And I'm glad Nicole asked. I had a very, very lucky, extravagant experience to be trekking in Nepal. And we were going toward a northwestern kingdom called Mustang. And the king of Mustang had the complete market on the Tibetan plateaus, salt and gold and lapis lazuli. And he pulled them into Mustang, and then he had it all taken to Kathmandu for trading. And he was very rich as a result and built extravagant Buddhist temples, which everyone wants to go on a trek to see. And we were in one of the villages on the way. And this village, like every village, it had a relative of the king, and she was very powerful, and she had organized the local women in this village, and they had built a women's center. Physically, they participated in building it. We walked by it and didn't see it, but they invited us to come have Tibetan tea and Tibetan cakes with them in their women's center, where they did educational programs for children. You know, they were doing the work of service that we're thinking about. And this was the hub, and we hadn't even really noticed it. But once inside, of course, they welcomed us, and then they entertained us with Tibetan songs and Tibetan dances and told us about the programs they were doing. And then they pointed to us and they said, sing us a song, show us a dance from your place. And we were like, holy moly, you're kidding me. And yet we had to, they were absolutely insistent. We want to know your place through a song and a dance. And we were befuddled, but we had to do something. And because I have sung a lot of my life, you know, I became the organizer. And you can imagine the silliness and their profound delight as we shared what we 5 white women of the same pretty much class and education could provide them. The dance part was the tough part. And what did we do? We showed them the hokey pokey. And we sang the hokey pokey, and we put our arms in, we put our arms out. We taught them the hokey pokey. We shared the hokey pokey as we had tried to share in their Tibetan dance. We had become somehow exchanging place. And yet, I'm very aware that we chose a song that would have been very, very different from the song and dance that many in other places, even in Atlanta, might have shared. If we had been more on the Buford Highway areas or in other areas of northern Georgia, there would have been Asian dances and song. There would have been Hispanic dances and song, Latin American dances. There would have been African American dances and songs. And the complexity of place comes alive in many ways when we share song and dance. And learning with Thurman's encouragement to be still enough to hear God's invitation to notice, oh, that's the Women's Center. Wonder what that building is. There are children out in the yard, and then to share songs and dances with them. That's the kind of complexity that our community partnerships are going to bring to us. And over time, we'll be learning about those communities. There's so much we can invite to learn, and with God's grace, of what other communities can bring to us, and they will invite us to share as well. And there's a deep humility in it that I think Thurman is always calling us to, a kind of humility around place. And Thurman's the last thing I'll say about Thurman's kind of notions of being humble and still enough and awake enough to think about the complexity of songs and dances and histories in any place we're partnering with is his image of the roots of a place, the metaphorical roots and the real roots, what indigenous plants grow there, what have people planted there as part of their cultures over hundreds of years, but also the stories about them. And Nicole and others have talked to us about this idea of service being stories shared of places. And of course, songs and dances are stories, and learning to nurture the shared roots, the new roots, learning about their roots. This is all part of our process, and it's not simple. It's very complex. And maybe at some point today, or even later this morning in our time together, you can think yourself about a place that really matters to you. And if you wanted to share it with someone else, what image would you use? What song might you sing? What history might you tell? What particular cultural act would you signal as, this is who we are? This is what matters to us. This is what we've been through. This is what pain we've endured. This is what violence we've known. This is our hope. Places are thick, and being a community partner as faithful people invites us to really think deeply about coming to know the other place. And I'm going to talk now about a couple of different ways. This field of place has become very hot in the academy. Lots of people are thinking about place now. It's called cultural geography because we've learned so much from kind of colonialisms moving in and taking over a place. And we don't want to be doing that in our community partnerships. And Epiphany, I think, has always been attentive to that. But I want to share a couple of different ways of thinking about the complexity of being a partner in another partner's place by giving you a couple of different angles on this topic. And so, Nicole, if you'll go to the next slide. So, of course, anyone in urban Atlanta, and for many of us beyond just the urban ring, but the neighborhoods that we might be working in, the neighborhoods of Emmaus House, Grady is an incredibly important place in their lives. And one of the things that places do is they do hold these stories and about the real meaning and mystery of life. And Grady has been all about that for generations. And you can still get on an elevator at Grady, where I've done a little bit of work over the years. And there'll be a conversation in there about, I was born at Grady. And it matters. And that kind of more than human sense of the place, the building itself. And here's this picture of Grady, shows the new wing of Grady. There's a whole new wing of Grady. It places, even Grady, continue to evolve. And that sense of being tuned in to a place over time that's important to the communities we're partnering with is really significant. I first was doing urban work as a young person in urban Atlanta, downtown Atlanta. And if you did work in those communities, Grady's was central, and you were always helping someone get to Grady or take a child to a clinic. And I learned that there was an assumption in my DeKalb County community that urban Atlantans, especially African Americans, mispronounced Grady by calling it the Gradys, plural. And there was a sense that they just didn't know better. But the truth of the situation was, if you were there on the ground, is that Grady is the Gradys. Not only in evolving over time, but it's always been a clinic-oriented hospital. There's the main hospital itself, but attached are buildings and even inside, and there are all these clinics. There are clinics for babies. There are clinics for diabetes. And you're going to one of the Gradys, meaning one of the clinics. So that sense of learning to listen to someone else's story of a place really teaches us aspects that we just didn't know and didn't understand. So we can go to the next slide, Nicole. And I'm sure many of you have worked a lot at Grady, and some of you are probably staff at Grady. So you have this sense of how complex places can be. Gary Snyder is a writer. And he has a wonderful quote: one can be in a place as a kind of visitor, or one can become an inhabitant. And I bring this up with the picture of Epiphany because I think what this community engagement committee and Nicole are trying to invite us to understand is, when we begin to shape our partnerships with other communities in Atlanta, or build on what we've already done. And I know that many of you have been involved in amazing community-based and community-partnered work for a long time through Epiphany. There are others of us who just kind of visit the idea of helping through Epiphany. But it's really important for us to know our own story. And part of this curriculum is helping us really listen again to our story of Epiphany, making a commitment to community partnership. Out of our place, Decatur, and into other places in Atlanta. And in many ways, the first step that we're being offered in the Sunday school curriculum is, how do we become an inhabitant of our story of being a parish family that wants to be in partnership with other groups? And we've been doing that a long time, but we're revisiting our own story, if you will. We're becoming habituated to it again, knowing the habits of it again, inhabiting maybe even a little bit of a different story about being community engaged, not just showing up and doing the work, which is great. And you're always invited to do that. But there's a kind of visitor sense of that. And I think this curriculum is calling us to an aspect of our own place, which is to be rethinking, what does community partnership mean for Epiphany now? Because it evolves over time. And that takes me to another angle. The next slide, Nicole. Which is, Edward Casey is a philosopher of place. And Pam would have to tell you, he's very dense and he's a beautiful writer. But he talks about place as more than a location. And I think that's what the amazing 2-hour tour of Decatur offered some of us a couple of Sunday afternoons ago. And when you look at this courthouse of Decatur, there are lots of cultures that have lived on that land, including plant cultures. And they've embedded their stories there. There are literal histories, of course, the history of the building itself, the history of when it was put up, the history of colonization. There are arts and movements that have been part of that place. There is the result of politics and domination, as well as compassion and compromise, he says. For us to look at a building, and when we go down to Summerhill or again to Peoplestown or Pittsburgh's, or if we're in English Avenue or over by the Atlanta University complex neighborhoods, these are all very thick entities where histories and natural world cultures, what they've discovered at the old Wheat Street Gardens was a housing complex on Auburn Avenue. And it's now been torn down. It's near the Martin Luther King Center, right next to it, really. It's just blank ground now. But that we've learned in there is a whole horticulture of what African Americans planted in the 30s and 40s. Plants they knew how to raise, plants they knew how to cook. And any place we go is going to have these legacies that we would do well to pay deep attention to. And that's part of being in the place of our neighbors. And the next slide gives another angle of it, which is that our becoming aware of the thickness of place and educating ourselves about it means that we also have a kind of accountability to learn about their stories and to act with them, to participate in the stories of the place that they have known, and maybe the stories they're trying to tell. As you all, know from those neighborhoods, I grew up in Atlanta, and I do remember the original baseball stadium for the Atlanta Braves, and I remember the Turner Stadium being built, and the neighborhood Summerhill, it's right there, has been the brunt of those development projects for decades and decades and decades, the disruption of their places. And Georgia State is now coming in to develop that area with Turner. And right next to it, of course, right abutting Summerhill is Peoplestown and the community of Emmaus House. And next door is Pittsburgh, another area. And there's a lot of accountability for how those neighborhoods have been jostled. And there are a lot of stories about the complexity of how political power and money. We all know the story of Auburn Avenue as being an amazing African-American hub of business and power. The 1906 riots, right there, riots, racial killing on Auburn Avenue. And then the 85-75 connector just splitting Auburn Avenue in two, which of course massively disrupted that cultural and financial center that was Auburn Avenue. And there's accountability for that. Without knowing the story of the place, you can't understand how to engage today. It's very important when we do our work at Emmaus House to learn some of the history and stories of the place. And I'm sure many of you know them, but there's a deep richness there. So if we're with people from Emmaus and to ask them, how long have you lived here? And what's it been like? I was at a birthday party 2 years ago, and a woman and I were just chatting, and then it turned into the Peoplestown neighborhood. And all of a sudden she said, oh, I grew up in Peoplestown. And then she said, Emmaus House always gave us Christmas gifts and stockings. And then I said, you're kidding me. This woman is a graduate of the Harvard Business School, African-American woman. And she understood her story as a completely coherent arc. And Emmaus House was critical to it, but she could talk a lot about the accountability of the neighborhood. So knowing that story holds us accountable ethically, and certainly as spiritual people, we're aware of that important learning as we move into our partnerships at an even deeper level, or maybe new partnerships. Maybe we're doing work in Vine City or English Avenue. So the next slide, Nicole. Well, there's another angle. The kind of phenomenon means that our stories are always about entanglements. So there's a kind of emotional and spiritual preparation we're called to, I think, to learn about things that we didn't know and maybe don't feel very good about. We see the complexity of lives interweaving in Atlanta, where we didn't quite understand the history that way, or what happened to economies like Auburn Avenue, the kinds of creativities that have emerged. And of course, we know the African-American creative community in Atlanta with film and with hip hop and rap is extensive. So it's an alive process being in a place. And that some of the places, like I think about the neighborhood of Bedford Pines, which is next to Boulevard, Ponce de Leon and Boulevard, all the way to Auburn Avenue. And that neighborhood and Buttermilk Bottom behind the old Presbyterian Center, these are neighborhoods that went through model cities, which I was working some in Bedford Pines when that happened. And model cities is like every renewal program. It had its rationales. There were a good deal of buildings in Bedford Pines that were in horrific shape and very, very dangerous buildings. But there were also buildings of deep story and churches. And when you got to know the roots of that place and the stories, if you entangled yourself with it, then when model cities came through, the plan, they just raised those buildings. In other words, they bulldozed the neighborhood, and you can still see that in a number of places. They built some new buildings, but that took time. So everyone was moved out to what we call Holloway. I think that's the name of the road now. It was called the Bankhead Highway when I knew it. And talk about disrupting and a kind of ecosystem. Entanglement is also like an ecosystem. And Bedford Pines had a lot of those. The corner store that would run a tab when your Social Security check wasn't there yet. There were no grocery stores. Of course, grocery stores wouldn't come into that neighborhood. So knowing that it's an ongoing ecology, every place we're partnering with, the complexity of it, without judgment, but learning to listen, take it to heart, see God's presence in it. That's what we're being called to. Who has the rights to the city? As David Harvey, who's a scholar of place, likes to say, who has the rights to the city? So the next slide, please, Nicole. So I'm just suggesting that when we think about place, we start with our own stories, which is my own personal spiritual path of what does service mean for me in this place called Epiphany, and maybe what am I being called to now, the way Thurman was listening from his rowboat. What is it that I really feel called to? Because it's important. I think I've learned the hard way over and over and over to really do that kind of mindful, prayerful listening, because I have a lot of thoughts about what I ought to be doing and should be doing in community engagement. When maybe God is calling you, and maybe your own heart is calling you to something a little different. And then we're at Epiphany trying to look at the purpose of, well, what do we want to be doing now? How do we want to be thinking about our place and working on our story of place, interconnecting with others' places and learning their stories right now? The history will be part of the right now, but maybe they want to do some new things, and maybe we can be liaisons with Georgia State, or who knows, so that we then are becoming together with our partners place-based engagement. We're shaping place-based engagement that becomes a story of us, and that's pretty complicated and pretty difficult work, and absolutely critical work, because that helps us be publicly clear about our service, so that we're thinking in a broader way that we, as people who are hoping and wanting to align deeply with the work of God in the world, the incarnate work of God in the world, this is the story we bring in partnership with the stories and the place of the communities we work with, so that we can participate in a public narrative of what it means to be serving, working together, partnering, engaged together. It's a reconciling kind of process. I think there's maybe one more slide, Nicole, and then we can open it for questions and discussions. Yeah, so we just want to think about what place is meaning to us at Epiphany, and to us individually, to our community partners, and to how we're thinking about our relationships and actions and plans, because these partnerships are really reconciling work, as Thurman calls them. They're a way of coming into relationship at a deeper level, but for us as Christians, they're about the reconciling work of God in the world, and paying attention to our stories and sharing and listening to stories of our partners, and then creating a story together of community partnered action. It needs all these qualities of accountability and of history and of listening carefully, of justice, and song and dance, and that's always evolving. It's always calling us into new insight. That's how we grow as Christians. So I'm just bringing that little additional, very large, very complicated aspect of community engagement, this aspect of place, and knowing more about places and becoming more proximate to them. It's part of our long-term reconciliation work. So thank you, Nicole. I think you can take that. Yeah, there's just a last, and one way we mobilize with others is just to be clear about our stories and to have our strategies of what we want to be doing and our action, being able to tell that, being able to make sense of that. That's another GANS related graphic. So the importance of place, that's all and I know many of you already know the importance of place, and many of you have tremendous histories in this place. And you know, histories of Peachtree Pine. Many of us have had. Oh, I have strong memories myself of the beginning of Peachtree Pine and all that went on, and being on the staff of St. Luke's with Peachtree Pine and our own Crossroads Center and the food bank starting there. And yeah, the integration of the Grady's. Yeah, John and Kathy, you want to say, you want to say something about that? John and Catherine? Catherine, you want to say something about the Grady's?
Yeah, the Grady Hospital was the white hospital that became Georgia Hall after they integrated. And I had heard people talk about the day when they were moving patients across. So yeah, I wasn't there at the time. Yeah, I was in high school, but it was definitely the Grady's at that point. My mother was born at the Grady Hospital.
Right, absolutely.
I would like to comment about that. I worked at Grady for 36 years.
Beautiful.
And the reason it's called the Grady's is because originally there were two hospitals.
Yeah.
There was the white hospital and the colored hospital.
Yes.
In fact, they were that medical record numbers. The white hospital and medical record numbers were prefixed with a W, and the colored hospital was prefixed with a C. So, and when they built the existing building originally, it was built as a segregated facility. It was a mirror image of it. One side was white, and the other side was black. And then eventually, of course, they integrated, and eventually they did away with the W and C on the medical record number. But it was called the Grady's from that era, and it's always been that since then.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Those are incredibly important. Very much the segregation assumptions. Racist segregation. What are stories about place?
You know, Bobbi, one of the things that this conversation makes me think of is not only building the awareness and the capacity to understand what histories and cultures are present in the places and spaces that we're, currently in, but also what histories and stories we are bringing into those with our bodies, because our bodies signify certain stories and histories. And that all of that is merging when we occupy space together. And I wonder how maybe you can talk a bit to that, talking about both how we're building capacity to do that well, but also to prevent the overwhelm of thinking about so many things in the event of the encounter. And that I think is spiritual work. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think it's not simple work. I think it's one of the reasons that community partnerships are always long-term work. I think that our own work at Epiphany around questions of structural racism, kind of different levels of our own histories in our neighborhoods, in our personal experiences, can make that story shared among ourselves a really important aspect of our going to be partnering with other people. I think I'm doing some work on a national level and just learning so much about race and racism and those histories. And one of the things I'm learning that is both of deep pain to us in the South, but of also advantage is we are in a community with significant African American neighbors, lots of African Americans here still, the legacy of slavery still present, but we are not doing this work in a vacuum. And I think that's where Thurman's notion of humility and listening and paying attention and asking deep questions out of that, our own questions out of that humility, and the stories. Tell us the stories. What have you known about this neighborhood? That our spiritual work is critical for it. I think of Catherine's sermon and reading and preparing ourselves, and but also learning that in some ways on a daily level, showing up to do work, which many of you have done, there is space, and it's a gift of the Spirit to be there and do the work and allow the Spirit to bring us together in the work, so that it's not all about us kind of coming with the thickness and the embroiledness of our histories and the tough stories. We all are there to do shared work. It's just learning to be, as Thurman would say, humble and listening, being sure that I'm listening. But I think that story of wanting to hear other people's, they want to hear our stories too. That sense too of it's just, about me listening to your stories. That's where Gantz is so beautiful. It's about really sharing stories and being aware of our stories. And Catherine gave them today, and Bill gave them today. I was there. I know that, and that's very powerful. I don't know if I'm getting there, Nicole, but that's what and I think this is deeply spiritual work, deeply individual work at many levels, but it's communal work, and it's what we're doing together right now.
Bobbi, I've been intrigued by all of these groups that have popped up, not just, I think our religious communities have been part of this, but the secular world has been part of it too. People who get together across difference to share a meal. And those things were just kind of popping up everywhere, it seemed. That's a movement that we can celebrate. But also, you're right. I mean, and what Nicole, I think, was getting at, when you go into those new relationships, those new situations that you're establishing, there needs to be some preparation of your own self, and how to hold what you hear with respect. And I heard your reference to Brian Stevenson and proximity. I remember a sermon that I've listened to virtually that he preached out in California, and he talked a lot about proximity and how proximity leads to awareness and leads to compassion for others and change. And so I think that's, I connected with so much of what you said, and you say it with such grace. And
well, I think, Paul, one of the things I think about proximity, and maybe this also connects to Nicole's insight, is that, for Catherine and Bill, I may be wrong, but proximity, that Grady is a space they've known, is that you make mistakes. And in this book of mine, it's mostly about mistakes I made. and they were very inconsequential and just really bad. Really bad. Some of them really bad. But that proximity issue is the way in which the grace of God incarnate over time and with relationship building and sharing, that's part of life, that one makes mistakes. But if there's relational power there, then there can be anger, and, there can be disconnect, but it's not the end of the world.
Well, and Bobbi, I think it's so important what you said about just the stories and creating the time space and the openness, open heart, open mind to asking about and hearing people's stories. And it's something that I've had to learn over this last year with so much of the racial injustice, and even my colleagues having no idea some of the experiences that they have been through in their lives that have really shaped who they are, or in our experiences I could never have assumed, couldn't relate to, and I don't know that I can relate to, but I now understand them and their life history a little more about, just how they approach the world.
Yeah.
So I love that you reminded us about that importance.
Oh, well, thank you, Pam. I think, and I think it's part of our work at Epiphany, which I think you're also talking about, is just to share the stories that we have of this neighborhood and this city, as well as the stories of people we're working with in other communities than Epiphany. Yeah. It's and I really think that we may overlook the natural stories too. Or someone was writing, the construction of 75 over Auburn Avenue, or Wheat Street Gardens, and what we're discovering about what was planted there. That there's lots of depth, and of course it'll keep emerging over time. It's that word entanglement. It's not that we have to do it all today or have to have it all understood today, but it's about the ongoing interest in being entangled, if you will. And many of you have been entangled in these communities a long time, and but to invite the parish in a larger way into Epiphany's story of being a place-based, engaged community with other place-based communities, that's what it means to be at Epiphany. That's a kind of narrative we're developing among ourselves to tell newcomers over generations, and then hearing the other people's stories of people we're partnering with.
One of the things that I thought about during your talk this morning, Bobbi, is my history at Epiphany. Stan McGraw was the rector when we came.
Oh gosh, I remember
Stan was deeply frustrated with us, and we were, I don't think we were frustrated with him. I think we were puzzled. He wanted us to be engaged in a way we didn't understand how to be engaged in. He wanted that so badly, and he didn't know how, and he didn't know how to express it to us in a way that we understood and could act on.
Yeah.
And I've seen us change some.
Yeah.
Not enough, maybe, but I've seen us change some over these many years. Mm-hmm. And Stan started us, I think, on that because he had this vision that he couldn't quite communicate to us.
Yeah.
And we have built a little bit on that. So I've seen some change at Epiphany.
Oh, but what an absolutely critical aspect of Epiphany for us to know. And Stan absolutely was just so visionary, but it was really like now or never. It's a great prophetic stance. And most of us can't tolerate a prophet very long. And and prophets have their particular gifts. But what I think Nicole and Amy and all of you in leadership around this are encouraging us to understand is this is an ongoing entanglement. This is a growing garden, and we're going to be weeding, and there'll be a slow season and there'll be faster seasons. But he planted this beautiful seed that's now becoming more and more richly the story of who we are. And but I think there's something about place, and Casey is really good at thinking about this, that is organic. I mean, we have to push at certain times, and right now, as the culture has gone through so much important kind of recognition and reckoning around structural racism, and exclusions of all kinds, that it's a push and we're taking advantage of that, but it's an emerging growth in God that we're doing now, and place-based thinking is very important to that, very important. And I'm just so grateful for all of you who've been so involved in that for so many years that I see in these windows.
Bobbi, something that comes for me about something that comes up for me about place as we talk about these things and meeting people in their communities and so forth is, for years I taught the high school Sunday school class, and we studied the history of Epiphany using Tom Mundy's book, and going and visiting the various places and talking to parishioners like Sylvia Etheridge and others that had been around a long time. And one of the things I'm very aware of is that our current location was chosen because of white flight out of the location in Inman, at the back of Inman Park, where the church was at the time. And I just keep thinking about that as we try to find a way to go back to communities, about that part of our history that was all about separating ourselves from those communities. And I just feel a need to sort of name that right now because I struggle with it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that also, because I think when we know our histories, there's a lot of grief that can go with that. And maybe we need to, and maybe this is in a very spiritual place where we really need to weep for those past stories and what happened, as at the same time we give a new vision of what we want to be in the future.
Wow. Thank you both. That's really important.
Sewanee, the history of Sewanee and what's going on at Sewanee now is a perfect example of what was just said, and what they're dealing with. And Episcopal Church is a different institution than what it was, not just in the South either. I think we've come a long way though. From all that.
It's important too. It's important to name that too. I really believe that, but I'm thinking, of Ellen and Nancy, that it makes me think of the land acknowledgement idea, that you could, simply, it might be possible for us as a community to discuss, do we say we're from Epiphany Episcopal Church, and we're in Decatur now, very committed to our community partnerships, and we do that as we acknowledge that we were part of white flight out of Inman Park when we got our new location. It's just a way of acknowledging it, and that has a great deal of power for us, and I think for the communities hearing us. Bobbi?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Somebody else came in, that's okay.
But well, go ahead, Barbara.
I've been here 15 years, so I'm a relative newcomer when you start talking about these kinds of things, right? We haven't all been here for even, a lot of rectors, what I'm saying. So but I think that there also needs to be, and I think you talked about it in terms of who we are as self, that we who did not grow up here still bring something about place of where we were and what we experienced maybe during the time, what I experienced by coming coming south in 1960 and working in a hospital where I walked in and there was colored bathroom and white bathroom, and I had not grown up that way. Let me put it that way. Not to say it wasn't segregated in the North, because it was by housing for sure. But that kind of shock and shock that made at least me want to work with that, want to work to overcome that kind of thing. And I bring that to Epiphany still, you know, and to learn these stories of place, of why it's where it is, of what land it occupied is really, really important here. At the same time, that those of us who haven't been here forever have something to give from our own histories.
That's very, I think that's the story of our story is very important. Thanks, Barbara. And David, I'm aware time is moving, but, and I'm happy to be here. I just want you all to know, if you haven't looked at your clock, look at your clock. Yes, David.
Well, it's something you said at the very beginning, Bobbi, makes me, and it kind of plays with what Barbara's saying to some extent. We have to have a beginning place at some point when we talk. And you were talking about the Muskogee Creek Nation and the land, you know, which was taken from them. We buy property in North Georgia. We're basically buying property that was taken from the Muskogee Creek. I mean, perhaps. And even then, they probably took it from other Native groups, you know, by force, or who knows. I don't know all that. But we have to have a beginning. We have a common understanding that we can build on, rather than just because it can go back and go back and go back. And the relevance to today depends, I think, to a great degree on where we make that beginning.
Oh, it's very helpful. It's a very interesting idea. Yeah. I think one of the things Joy Harjo gave us on Friday evening was a sense of, she even said it at one point. She said, you know, I've come back to Georgia and because I think of it, you know, it's my people's homeland. She said, and I toyed with the idea of staying on the the homeland. She said, but then I thought, oh, no, I want to be in Oklahoma. My people have been in Oklahoma now for generations. I don't want to be in Columbus, Georgia. I need Oklahoma. But she profoundly, and her poetry reflects it, expects the ethical act of our acknowledging this land was Muskogee Creek land. That's very important. But she's living her life today. She had a kind of wonderful way of naming it and saying it that way. And talking about the Trail of Tears in its kind of horror. But talk about song. She sang, she played a very special drum given to her by a very special low-key medicine woman who didn't like to be identified, but had obviously great power. And so she sang some songs with the drum, and very, very powerful. So, and that was learned in New Mexico, the further extension of her people beyond Oklahoma. So it's complicated, and it's all Nicole's genius and her fantastic with this committee's capacity to shape an absolutely amazing curriculum, I think, for the long haul of engagement. And if engagement isn't about the long haul, then it's kind of not gospel engagement, because God is working with us for the long haul, thank heaven. Anything else, Nicole?
I was just typing in the chat. Thank heaven, and thank you, Bobbi, for being with us today. Yes. And thank you to everyone. We will be continuing the conversation with a hiatus for Palm Sunday and Easter, but we'll be glad to see you again in the season, in the Easter season, I guess, where we continue this work together.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Bobbi. Thank you, Bobbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bobbi. This is great.
Thank all of you.
We're going to want to see the Hokey Pokey soon, though.
No, it was just crazy, Erin.
Oh, man, it's just so good, too. Put a little bit in, and then you got to put your whole self in.
Gotta have some humor.
When we're back in the parish hall.
Yeah.
Put your whole self in.
We have to practice.
I was amazed that you could come up with something. I wouldn't have known. I don't know that I could have come up with an American.
They were very persistent women. Extremely persistent.
Would
I tell you a quick story, Bobbi? When you said that, it made me think of, I used to live in Japan, and I was, almost twice as big as a lot of people. And I was staying in a small Japanese inn in the countryside, and you had to wear their yukata, which are like kimono, but they're summer robes, which barely fit around me. And I was forced to go up on stage to sing karaoke, because that was what was done. You just had to do that. So I had to sing. I ended up singing I Left My Heart in San Francisco up in front of everybody. And it just made me think of that when you told that story.
Yeah, but it was, it's the gift of sharing place. Yeah. And, again, just Catherine and Paul, to know Grady and to add more information and to sing another song. And this is the richness of place. No one can know it all. Mm-hmm. The power of place. And if we forget it, it's really a loss. It's really a loss. So that, I bet many of us have stories. No, we went on another trek to a different section near Everest. And this school, they had a huge program for us Tibetan children. Tibetans and they wanted us to sing a song. Sing a song.
Well, were you prepared at that point, though?
Much big. We were 13 of us, and it was, we were really from all. And we ended up saying the national anthem is too hard to sing for most of us. So someone said, I think I said, what about God Bless America?
Yeah.
And that's what we sang. I think many in the group were, perceived ourselves as kind of liberal and therefore a little bit wobbly around God Bless America. Is that the song we want to sing? But you know what? It's what we could sing, and they could not have been happier. They were about sing us one of your songs. And they really didn't know, over time in sharing place, we could have talked more about some of these songs and how they work. But in the moment, it was about, in a certain sense, giving way to their tradition. We sing songs as a greeting. And then we said, okay, then here's a song we can all sing on the spot. Now I would say if I ever take another trek, which we will prepare a song. we will discuss that on the hours and hours we're walking on the trail. What will be our song?
Do you know,
But that's how we're shaping a story of us.
Right.
That's so really important. What's the story of us? But Aaron, I can just imagine that must have been, especially with the clothing issue.
Well, and Bobbi, it makes me, there's a part of me that kind of was sad or aggrieved or something. It's like for all of us on screen, we're all like, oh my gosh, what would we have sung? Because there's something beautiful that so many cultures, it's about song and dance. You can think of so many cultures around the globe, and even some of the spirituals from slave time, right? That just would come to mind for that component of our community. But for the rest of us, it's like, what would that be?
It is, and I tried to say, if we hadn't been who we were, what would, and I was auditioning once for a small a cappella group, and I don't know why I didn't expect this. It's just the stupidity of youth, of me. But I got in that group, and it was a biracial group, or whites and blacks. And after I did some work with them, then they said, okay, now you sing a song and we'll join you. And I don't know. I was just like, I panicked because of the components of the group, this multiracial black-white group. But I promise you, I think it was just nothing than the Holy Spirit, but I had a very clear thing of what to sing, and I started to sing. And as soon as it started coming out of my mouth, I thought, oh my God, this is the worst choice. You are a jackass. And by the way, this audition is a failure. Because what came out of my mouth was, what a friend we have in Jesus. Oh. And I think it was my own heart's needing to get close to Jesus, because it was a very stressful audition. And I was shocked. Within 30 seconds, it was 5-part harmony. Everybody knew.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Everybody knew. And this was in New England at a secular elite school, and you would never over your dead body sing What a Friend We Have in Jesus in a public setting. Never.
A.G. Rose.
That's the only thing that came to me. So I just called it an act of the Spirit. But of course, no one in that room did not know that song. They knew it well enough to sing 5-part harmony. Yeah. And so sometimes it's okay to be wrong and floundering and frightened, and see if the Spirit will put a seed in your heart and try to go with it. And I've done that a number of times where it was a disaster. But okay. It's a disaster.
The song that I thought of that everybody sings, Jesus loves the little children, red and yellow, black and white. They all know it. It's like, ah.
And Catherine, the other thing is, this is, I think, some also, like why we are sharing our stories as we move into communities is there is a preciousness in that song in addition to its problem. Mm-hmm. And I really truly believe that Martin Luther King and others would know that that's the real work, that it's all and you're so in the midst of your studies, but that it's really having the ability over time to risk being in the presence of that, to say this is both and that was the issue with model cities. There were buildings that just really had important history in one way, but they were I was in them. They were so dangerous, gas leaking everywhere, just no money to fix it. You just can't keep letting people live there. It's more complicated. And but I love that red and yellow, black and white. Yeah.
Bobbi, the name Grady, I don't hear a lot of call to change that name. I hear it, in the high school and all that. And I was dumb enough not to know why anybody didn't like Grady. I had to learn that. You understand? So do you hear a call to change that name? Because I know you're still somewhat involved there.
Yeah, not so much this last year. COVID kind of shifted that, but
Yeah.
I don't.
Different. I think there's really a different attachment to.
Yeah, that's what I wondered. That's what I wondered. That it doesn't.
I think Grady. I think that Catherine's right. The attachment to the African American community is so strong.
It's okay. Yeah.
And the Grady of today. I mean, if you did not see that video of Grady workers made last fall as they were going through the pandemic, it is so powerful. And their refrain is, this is Grady. But this is who we are.
Yeah.
And we will be here. And, the young African-American staff person who couldn't get the words out, she kept breaking down, and the film allowed her to do that until she finally said. So if you haven't seen it, I think Catherine's right. It's very special.
That's what I wondered. Yeah.
And those legacies, they're part of the place, and it's dealing with it and living and trying to be with the complexity of it. That's the spiritual task, really. It's Jesus's experience of a holy God. I have to be with them, these humans that we have shaped, and they're a mess.
Right.
This is where I am. This is where I choose to be, in the mess, because they're all so beautiful.
Well, let's toss out Henry Grady and keep the Gradys.
Yeah. Thank you again, Catherine, for adding that.
Yeah, that's good.
Making it very, very clear. It was in my mind, and you made it very clear. Thank you. Okay, brothers and sisters, have a great day.